The mall sparkled with holiday cheer, but for 8-year-old Keisha Johnson, this Christmas would change everything. Write in the comment where you watching this video from. The mall was alive with holiday cheer, but under the surface lay an undercurrent of tension invisible to most. Bright, twinkling lights decorated every corner, casting a warm glow over a carefully manufactured fantasy. Oversized ornaments hung from the ceilings, and a choir sang classic carols near the central fountain. Yet, amidst the festive distractions, Marcus Johnson felt something colder than the December air biting at him. The weight of being seen, yet unseen. Marcus stood at the back of the line for Santa's workshop, his 8-year-old daughter Keisha clutching his hand. She looked up at him with eyes full of wonder, her small body bundled in her best coat, the one he'd spent hours patching last winter to keep out the chill. She had been talking about this visit to Santa for weeks, scribbling her wishes in her little notebook with the precision of a child who understood the value of hope. To her, this was magic. To Marcus, it was something else entirely. He scanned the crowd. Families bustled about, most of them white, dressed in expensive coats and shiny boots. The parents sipped lattes from sleek cups while their children clutched new toys in shiny bags. Marcus felt the usual tug of discomfort, the way his presence seemed to ripple through spaces like this. Some parents threw quick, curious glances his way, their expressions neutral but charged. Others simply ignored him, their eyes sliding past as if he were part of the scenery. "Daddy, do you think Santa will like my list?" Keisha asked, breaking his train of thought. Marcus crouched down, bringing himself to her level. "Santa's gonna love it, baby girl. You've been working hard on that list, haven't you?" She nodded enthusiastically. "I even drew a picture of the doll I want. She has curly hair like mine, and I gave her a little lab coat because she's a scientist." Marcus smiled, though his chest tightened. Keisha's requests were simple, but he knew they carried weight. A doll that looked like her, dark-skinned with natural curls, wasn't something you found on every shelf. And the lab coat? That was Keisha dreaming bigger than anyone had taught her to. He wanted nothing more than to nurture that dream, to tell her the world would embrace it. But he knew better. The line moved slowly, snaking toward the grand chair where Santa Claus sat like a king on his throne. Robert Kavanaugh was an imposing figure, with his snow-white beard and crimson suit that seemed tailored to perfection. To the children, he was the embodiment of Christmas cheer. To Marcus, he was just another old white man pretending to care. As they inched closer, Marcus watched the interactions. Robert's booming "ho ho ho" seemed louder for some children, softer for others. His laughter lingered longer for certain kids, his patience stretching thinner for others. Marcus noticed the difference, and it made his jaw tighten. He'd seen it 1,000 times in 1,000 places, the unspoken rules of who mattered more. Finally, it was Keisha's turn. She stepped forward, her small boots squeaking on the polished floor. Marcus gave her an encouraging nod, but he stayed close, his arms crossed protectively over his chest. "Ho ho ho! And who do we have here?" Robert's voice was cheerful, though it carried an undertone that Marcus caught immediately. It wasn't warm. It wasn't kind. It was rote. "My name is Keisha," she said, her voice clear but tentative. She held her notebook tightly, her fingers gripping the edges. "I wrote my Christmas wish in here." Robert leaned forward, peering down at her. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, Keisha, have you been a good girl this year?" "Yes, Santa," she said earnestly. "I've been really good. I even helped my dad with the dishes after dinner." Robert chuckled lightly, but it was a hollow sound. "That's nice, dear. And what would you like for Christmas?" Keisha opened her notebook and carefully turned to the page she had spent so much time on. It was a crayon drawing of a doll, complete with dark brown skin, curly black hair, and a bright white lab coat. Next to the doll was a picture of a toolbox, labeled, "For Dad." "I want a doll that looks like me," she said, her voice gaining confidence. "And I want her to be a scientist because I want to be a scientist someday. And," she paused, looking back at Marcus before continuing, "I want a new toolbox for my dad. His old one is broken." Robert stared at the drawing for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he leaned back in his chair and let out a low laugh. A doll like you, huh? That's different. Keisha's smile faltered. Yes, Santa, she said quietly. I couldn't find one in the stores, so I thought maybe you could help. Robert waved a gloved hand dismissively. Well, sweetheart, Santa's workshop doesn't make every kind of toy. Maybe you'd like a Barbie instead? Or a nice teddy bear? Keisha blinked, her lips pressing together. No, thank you, Santa. I really want the doll. Robert's smile tightened. We'll see, dear. Santa's got a lot of children to think about, you know. Not everyone gets what they want. Marcus stepped forward then, his presence looming over the exchange. His eyes locked onto Robert's, and for a moment, the jovial mask of Santa Claus slipped. Robert's expression hardened ever so slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face before he quickly replaced it with a practiced grin. Come on, Keisha, Marcus said, his voice firm but calm. Let's go. Keisha hesitated, glancing back at Santa one last time before stepping off the platform. Marcus placed a protective hand on her shoulder, guiding her away from the throne. As they walked, he could feel the heat rising in his chest, anger simmering just beneath the surface. But he swallowed it down, focusing instead on Keisha's small hand clutching his. Did I do something wrong, Daddy? She asked softly as they exited the workshop area. Marcus stopped and knelt in front of her, his large hands resting on her tiny shoulders. No, baby girl, you didn't do anything wrong. Some people just don't know how to see how special you are. Keisha nodded, though her brow furrowed in confusion. She didn't understand yet, but Marcus knew she would. Sooner or later, the world would show her its cracks, its ugliness. He just hoped she'd be strong enough to face it. As they walked through the mall, the festive decorations seemed dimmer, the holiday cheer less bright. Marcus held Keisha's hand tightly, his mind racing. Santa had brushed her off, dismissed her dream with the ease of someone who'd never had to question their own place in the world. And worse, he'd done it without even realizing the damage he'd caused. But Marcus realized something else, too. Keisha hadn't backed down. She'd stood there, unwavering, and told Santa what she wanted, what she deserved. And if Santa wouldn't give it to her, Marcus vowed to himself that someday, she'd take it anyway. The car ride home from the mall was silent, but the air between Marcus and Keisha was anything but empty. Snow fell gently outside, piling onto the edges of the narrow roads as the city's holiday lights glimmered faintly in the distance. Keisha sat in the back seat, her notebook clutched tightly against her chest. Her small face turned toward the window. She didn't cry. She was too proud for that. But Marcus could see the disappointment in her posture. The way her usually chatty demeanor had been replaced by a quiet stillness. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white against the dark leather. He could feel anger bubbling up inside him, sharp and relentless. It wasn't just about what had happened with Santa. It was about everything that moment represented. It was about a world that seemed determined to tell his daughter that she was less than, less seen, less important, less deserving. And it was about a man who was tired of watching it happen, powerless to stop it. Daddy! Keisha's voice broke the silence. Yes, baby girl? Marcus asked, his tone softening instantly. Why didn't Santa like my list? Marcus's heart clenched. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror and saw her wide, curious eyes staring back at him. He searched for the right words, something that wouldn't crush her spirit but wouldn't lie to her either. Sometimes, people don't understand things that are different, he said carefully. It doesn't mean what you asked for wasn't good. It just means Santa wasn't the right person to understand it. Keisha frowned. But he's Santa. Isn't he supposed to help all the kids? Marcus hesitated. He is, he said finally. But sometimes even grown-ups don't do what they're supposed to. That's why it's important for you to remember that your dreams are special, no matter what anyone else says. Keisha nodded slowly, her little hands relaxing their grip on the notebook. Do you think I can still get the doll? She asked after a pause. Marcus smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. I think if anyone can make it happen, It's you. When they pulled into the driveway of their modest two-bedroom house, Keisha was back to her usual self, skipping toward the front door and humming a Christmas tune under her breath. But Marcus lingered in the car for a moment, his hands resting on the wheel as he stared out at the falling snow. He thought about everything that had led to this moment. The sacrifices, the struggles, the quiet battles fought every day to give his daughter a better life. Marcus hadn't always lived in this neighborhood. Once, he'd had dreams that reached far beyond the limits of his current reality. He had been one of the best students in his engineering program, graduating at the top of his class despite juggling 2 part-time jobs to pay his way through college. His professors had called him brilliant, innovative, a natural leader, and for a while he believed them. When he landed an interview at Horizon Toys, a major player in the toy industry, he thought his life was finally about to change. The company had a reputation for innovation, and Marcus had spent weeks perfecting his pitch for a line of STEM toys designed to inspire kids to pursue careers in science and engineering. He'd even built a prototype for a modular robotics kit that could be adapted for children of different age groups. The interview had gone well, or so he thought. The panel had seemed impressed with his ideas, and one of the senior executives had even joked about seeing his work on shelves someday. But weeks passed and the call never came. When he finally followed up, he was told the position had been filled. No explanation, no feedback, just a polite brush-off that left him reeling. It wasn't until years later, during a chance encounter with a former classmate, that Marcus learned the truth. The job had gone to someone less qualified, someone whose father happened to golf with one of Horizon's board members. "You were too ambitious," his friend had told him, as though that was supposed to make him feel better. "They didn't think your ideas would sell. They wanted someone who could follow orders, not shake things up." Marcus had felt the sting of that rejection for years. It wasn't just about the job. It was about what it represented. It was a reminder that the world wasn't a level playing field, that his brilliance wasn't enough to overcome the invisible barriers placed in his path. But Marcus wasn't the type to wallow in self-pity. He'd found other work, less prestigious, less fulfilling but steady, and he'd poured everything he had into raising Keisha. She was his reason for everything. His reason for getting up in the morning, for pushing through the exhaustion that came with long hours and little pay. And she was the reason he refused to let bitterness consume him, even when the world gave him every reason to be angry. He wanted her to grow up believing she could be anything, do anything, despite the challenges that would inevitably come her way. Inside the house, Marcus found Keisha at the kitchen table, her notebook open in front of her. She was sketching again, her tongue sticking out slightly as she concentrated on the page. He leaned against the doorway, watching her quietly for a moment before speaking. "What are you working on?" he asked. Keisha looked up and smiled. "I'm making the doll better," she said, holding up the page. "I gave her a stethoscope and a little beaker so she can be a doctor or a scientist." Marcus walked over and sat beside her, studying the drawing. "She's beautiful," he said sincerely. "Just like the person who made her." Keisha beamed. "Do you think other kids would like her?" Marcus nodded. "I think every kid would love her. You've got something special here, Keisha." Keisha's eyes lit up with excitement, but then her expression turned serious. "Do you think Santa will understand next time?" she asked quietly. Marcus hesitated, his mind flashing back to the dismissive look on Robert's face. He wanted to say yes, to tell her that people would eventually see her the way he did. But he also knew the truth. Santa wasn't the problem. He was just a symptom of something bigger, something deeper. "I think," Marcus said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "that sometimes it's not about waiting for people to understand. Sometimes it's about showing them what they're missing." Keisha nodded, her small hands gripping the edges of her notebook. She didn't fully understand what her father meant, but she felt the weight of his words. And somewhere deep inside her, a seed was planted, a determination to prove herself, to create something that couldn't be ignored. As the snow continued to fall outside, Marcus and Keisha sat together at the kitchen table, their heads bent over her notebook. It was a quiet moment, but it carried the weight of something far greater. For Marcus, it was a chance to give his daughter the strength he wished someone had given him. For Keisha, it was the beginning of a journey that would take her further than she ever imagined. The snowstorm had intensified overnight, blanketing the streets and transforming the city into a winter wonderland. It was the kind of morning that invited lazy cups of hot cocoa and cozy blankets, but neither Marcus nor Keisha had time for leisure. Marcus had to leave early for a double shift at the hardware store, and Keisha had a big day at school, a presentation for her science project that she'd been working on for weeks. As Marcus tied his boots near the front door, Keisha bounded into the room holding a small diorama she'd made out of cardboard and craft supplies. It was a model of a solar system, with planets carefully painted in vibrant colors and suspended on thin wires. At the center, a tiny LED light represented the sun, glowing faintly as Keisha flicked the switch. "Look, Daddy," she said, her voice brimming with pride. "It lights up." Marcus grinned, kneeling to examine her work. "This is amazing, Keisha. Your teacher's going to love it." Keisha beamed, but her expression turned serious after a moment. "Do you think the other kids will like it?" she asked hesitantly. "Last time, some of them said my projects are weird." Marcus felt his chest tighten. He hated how quickly the world seemed to chip away at her confidence. How even at her young age, she was already questioning whether she belonged. "Don't you worry about what anyone else thinks," he said firmly. "You worked hard on this and it shows. Besides, being different is what makes you special. Don't ever forget that." Keisha nodded, her resolve strengthening under her father's encouragement. She hugged him tightly before grabbing her coat and backpack, ready to face the day. Later that morning, as Keisha stood in front of her class presenting her solar system model, Marcus was at work, stocking shelves in the hardware store's chilly back room. He moved with practiced efficiency, but his mind kept drifting to Keisha. He wished he could be there to see her presentation, to cheer her on like the other parents who had the luxury of free time. But bills needed to be paid, and there was no room for indulgences in their tight budget. The bell above the store's front door jingled, pulling Marcus out of his thoughts. He wiped his hands on his work apron and stepped into the main area, where a customer was browsing near the tool section. Marcus recognized him immediately. It was Robert Kavanaugh, the mall's Santa. Marcus froze for a moment, his stomach tightening as the memories of the previous day flooded back. Robert hadn't seen him yet, so Marcus took a deep breath and approached with the professional demeanor he had perfected over years of customer service. "Good morning, sir," Marcus said, his voice calm and even. "Can I help you find something?" Robert glanced up, his sharp blue eyes meeting Marcus's for the briefest moment before flicking away. There was no sign of recognition on his face, no indication that he remembered the father of the little girl whose dreams he had dismissed so casually. "I'm looking for a set of drill bits," Robert said curtly. "The ones I have at home aren't cutting it anymore." Marcus nodded and led him to the appropriate aisle. As they walked, he couldn't help but study the older man. Robert moved with the confidence of someone who had always been certain of his place in the world. His neatly pressed coat and polished shoes stood in stark contrast to Marcus's well-worn work boots and calloused hands. "This should have everything you need," Marcus said, gesturing to the display. He stepped back to give Robert space, but the older man lingered, inspecting the items with a critical eye. "You work here full-time?" Robert asked suddenly, his tone casual but laced with the kind of curiosity Marcus had encountered before. Curiosity that wasn't entirely innocent. "For now," Marcus replied evenly. He didn't feel the need to explain himself to this man. Robert nodded absently, selecting a box of drill bits and holding them up. "These good. They'll get the job done," Marcus said, forcing a polite smile. Robert nodded again, then turned toward the counter. Marcus followed, ringing up the purchase in silence. As he handed over the receipt, Robert hesitated, studying Marcus for a moment. "You look familiar," Robert said, his brow furrowing. "Have we met before?" Marcus met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "I don't think so," he said simply. Robert shrugged and pocketed his receipt. "Well, thanks for your help," he said, his tone dismissive as he walked out the door. Marcus watched him leave, the bell jingling faintly in his wake. He felt a rush of emotions. Anger, frustration, but also determination. Robert might not remember him, but Marcus couldn't forget. The interaction only strengthened his resolve to give Keisha the tools she needed to rise above people like Robert, people who would never see her for who she truly was. Meanwhile, at school, Keisha's presentation had taken an unexpected turn. Her solar system model had captivated her classmates at first, their eyes widening as the tiny sun lit up. But as she explained the science behind her project, one boy in the back snickered. "Why'd you make it so fancy?" he said loudly. "It's just a stupid project." A few other kids laughed, and Keisha felt her cheeks flush. She glanced at her teacher, who gave her an encouraging nod but didn't intervene. Taking a deep breath, Keisha straightened her posture and continued. "I made it this way because I wanted to show how cool science can be," she said firmly. "It's not stupid, it's important." Her voice wavered slightly, but her words carried weight. The boy rolled his eyes but fell silent, and the rest of the class watched her with newfound respect. When she finished, her teacher clapped enthusiastically, and a few of her classmates joined in. As Keisha returned to her seat, she felt a surge of pride. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Being different is what makes you special. That evening, when Marcus came home from work, Keisha was waiting for him at the kitchen table, her solar system model proudly displayed. She told him about the boy who had teased her and how she had stood her ground. Marcus listened intently, his pride in her growing with every word. "You handled that like a champ," he said, ruffling her hair. "I'm proud of you, Keisha." She grinned, the earlier disappointment with Santa fading into the background. For the first time, she started to believe that her dreams could withstand the world's doubts. But Marcus knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He knew there would be more moments like this, more challenges that would test her strength. And he knew he had to be ready to fight for her, to teach her how to fight for herself. As they sat together at the table, working on another drawing for Keisha's notebook, Marcus made a silent vow. He wouldn't let the world define her limits. She was going to shine no matter what. The morning after his visit to the hardware store, Robert Kavanaugh woke up in his large suburban home, tucked away in a quiet, predominantly white neighborhood. The house, though tastefully decorated for Christmas with garlands on the staircase and a tree that seemed plucked from a magazine cover, felt empty. His wife had passed years ago, and his children, though loving, had drifted into their own busy lives. It was just him now, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway his only company. Robert moved through his usual routine, brewing coffee and sitting by the window to watch the fresh snow blanket his yard. As he sipped from his steaming mug, his thoughts drifted back to the man at the hardware store. Marcus, the faint, nagging feeling that he had seen him somewhere before clawed at his mind. It wasn't uncommon for Robert to forget faces. He'd spent decades in the corporate world, working as an executive for Horizon Toys. Thousands of meetings, employees, and presentations had blurred together over the years. But something about Marcus lingered, a sharpness in his gaze, a tension in his demeanor that stirred unease in Robert. He brushed it off with a sigh and grabbed the morning paper from the doorstep, settling into his favorite chair. But as he flipped through the pages, an article caught his eye, stopping him mid-sip. Toys that look like us. A new wave of representation in the industry. The article featured a young black woman named Amira Davis, whose small toy company had been making waves for its inclusive line of dolls and STEM-based toys. Robert skimmed the article, his brow furrowing. The company's slogan, "Every child deserves a toy that reflects their dreams," stirred something uncomfortably familiar. He tried to ignore it, but the memory came rushing back. Keisha, the little girl from the mall, her big brown eyes shining with hope as she described the doll she wanted. Her father, standing just behind her, silent but commanding. Robert remembered the tension in that interaction now, the way the man's expression had darkened as Robert dismissed the girl's request. And then it clicked. Marcus was the man from the hardware store. The realization settled in his chest like a lead weight. Robert spent the rest of the day in a haze, his thoughts bouncing between the past and the present. He thought about his years at Horizon Toys, the decisions he'd made, the ideas he'd dismissed without a second thought. He remembered a younger version of himself, sitting in a boardroom, telling his team that diversity wasn't marketable. At the time, it had seemed like a harmless business decision. But now, the faces of all the children like Keisha, children whose dreams had been quietly invalidated, haunted him. Later that evening, Robert pulled out an old photo album from his time at Horizon. He flipped through the pages, past photos of product launches and holiday parties, until he found what he was looking for. A group photo from the day they had rejected Marcus's application. Robert barely remembered the details of the meeting, but he remembered the prototype Marcus had brought in, a modular STEM toy kit designed to inspire creativity in kids. He had dismissed it as too niche, and Marcus had been passed over for a less qualified candidate. Robert closed the album with a heavy sigh, shame pooling in his gut. It wasn't just Marcus he had dismissed. It was an entire generation of children who could have seen themselves in those toys. He had been so focused on maintaining the status quo that he had failed to see what truly mattered. The next day, Robert returned to the mall, his Santa suit feeling heavier than usual. He settled into the big wooden chair, greeting children with his usual cheer, but his heart wasn't in it. Every little face that looked up at him reminded him of Keisha's, bright, hopeful, and deserving of so much more than what he had given her. As the day wore on, he kept glancing at the line, half hoping and half dreading that Keisha and Marcus would return. But they didn't. Instead, the minutes stretched into hours, and the weight of his guilt grew heavier with each passing moment. By the time his shift ended, Robert had made a decision. He couldn't change the past, but he could start making amends. He would find a way to reach out to Marcus and Keisha, to let them know that he had been wrong. And more importantly, he would use whatever influence he still had to support the kind of change they represented. That evening, Robert sat at his desk, drafting an email to the CEO of Horizon Toys. He had retired years ago, but he still had contacts in the industry. He proposed a partnership with smaller, independent toy companies focused on diversity and inclusivity. He highlighted the potential market value, but also emphasized the moral responsibility of the industry to reflect the world's diversity. Before hitting send, Robert paused, his finger hovering over the mouse. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of purpose. He didn't know if the email would make a difference, but he had to try. Meanwhile, in their small but cozy home, Marcus and Keisha sat together at the kitchen table, working on a new project. Keisha had decided she wanted to build her own doll, and Marcus was helping her sketch out the design. Her determination lit up the room, and Marcus couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. "Do you think people will like her?" Keisha asked, holding up the drawing. "I think they'll love her," Marcus said, his voice steady with conviction. "And if they don't, you'll show them why they should." Keisha smiled, her eyes sparkling with a confidence that Marcus had fought so hard to protect. She didn't know it yet, but the world was about to see just how special she was. Robert stared at the draft email on his screen, reading and rereading his words until they blurred together. He'd chosen his phrasing carefully, but no amount of revision felt like enough. The message he was about to send was more than an apology. It was an acknowledgement of a lifetime of missed opportunities, of ingrained biases he'd never questioned, of a system he had perpetuated without a second thought. He hovered over the send button, hesitated, then clicked it. The email was gone, shooting off to the inbox of one of the most influential CEOs in the toy industry. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly, the silence of his home amplifying his uncertainty. Robert wasn't a man accustomed to self-reflection. For decades, he had lived in a bubble of privilege, shielded from the consequences of his decisions. But meeting Keisha and Marcus had cracked that bubble, forcing him to confront the reality of a world he'd ignored for too long. He knew the email was only the first step. If he truly wanted to make amends, he had to face Marcus and Keisha directly. Marcus wasn't thinking about Robert. He was too busy helping Keisha bring her vision to life. Their dining table had become a makeshift workshop, littered with scraps of fabric, sewing needles, and small containers of paint. Keisha worked with intense focus, her tongue poking out slightly as she carefully painted the face of her doll. "She's almost done, Daddy," Keisha said excitedly, holding up the doll for Marcus to see. The doll was beautiful, a miniature reflection of Keisha herself, with dark brown skin, natural curls, and a tiny white lab coat. Marcus felt a lump in his throat as he looked at it. It was more than just a toy. It was a symbol of everything Keisha was fighting for, of everything she deserved. "You've done an amazing job," Marcus said, his voice thick with pride. "You're going to change the world, Keisha. I can feel it." Keisha grinned, her eyes sparkling. "I'm going to make more of them," she said firmly. "And one day, they'll be in every toy store." Marcus didn't doubt it for a second. The next day, as Marcus dropped Keisha off at school, he noticed a familiar figure waiting near the entrance. It took him a moment to recognize Robert, standing awkwardly with a folder clutched in his hands. Marcus's jaw tightened, and his first instinct was to turn around and walk away. But Keisha noticed him too. "Daddy, isn't that Santa?" she asked, tilting her head. "It is," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "Go on to class, baby girl. I'll talk to him." Keisha nodded, giving her father a quick hug before skipping toward the school's entrance. Marcus watched her go, then turned to face Robert, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" Marcus asked, his tone measured but cold. Robert shifted uncomfortably, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. "I came to apologize," he said, "and to make things right if you'll let me." Marcus crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "You think an apology fixes what you did? What you represent?" "No," Robert admitted, his voice quiet, "but I'm trying to learn, and I want to help." Marcus said nothing, his silence heavy with skepticism. Robert opened the folder he was holding and handed Marcus a few papers. Marcus glanced at them, his brow furrowing as he read. "These are proposals I've sent to Horizon Toys," Robert explained. "I'm pushing for them to partner with smaller companies that focus on diversity and inclusivity. Companies like the one I think your daughter could start someday." Marcus looked up sharply. "What do you know about my daughter?" Robert hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I know she's brilliant. I know she deserves a world that sees her brilliance. And I know I've spent most of my life ignoring that brilliance in kids like her." Marcus stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he folded the papers and tucked them under his arm. "This doesn't erase what you did," Marcus said quietly. "But if you're serious about helping, you'd better follow through." "I will," Robert said, his voice firm. "You have my word." That evening, Marcus told Keisha about his encounter with Robert. First, she seemed confused. "Why would Santa want to help us now?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "Because sometimes people realize they've been wrong," Marcus said. "And when they do, it's up to us to decide if we want to give them a chance to do better." Keisha thought about this for a moment, then nodded. "I think we should give him a chance," she said. "But only one." Marcus smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "That's my girl." Over the next few weeks, Robert stayed true to his word. He used his connections to advocate for Keisha's vision, arranging meetings with toy designers and distributors who could help turn her dream into a reality. Slowly but surely, doors began to open. By the end of the year, Keisha's doll had gone from a single handmade prototype to a small production line funded by local investors. The dolls sold out within days, their popularity sparking a national conversation about representation in toys. As Keisha's success grew, so did Robert's understanding of the world he had ignored for so long. He became one of her biggest supporters, using his platform to amplify her message and challenge the industry to do better. For Marcus, watching Keisha's journey was both humbling and exhilarating. She had faced a world that tried to diminish her and had risen above it with grace and determination. And though the road ahead was still long, he knew she was ready to walk it. The warmth of spring brought new energy into the Johnson household. The snow had melted, and with it, the heaviness of the holiday season seemed to lift. Keisha's dining table workshop had expanded to take over the small living room, with fabrics, paints, and tiny tools spread across every available surface. Marcus didn't mind. Seeing his daughter's growing determination reminded him that their dreams, no matter how humble their beginnings, could become something extraordinary. "Daddy, do you think we could sell her at the store down the street?" Keisha asked one evening, holding up her latest doll. This one had curly braids tied with tiny ribbons, a deep brown complexion, and a miniature stethoscope draped around her neck. Marcus smiled, crouching down to get a closer look. "I think any store would be lucky to have her," he said. "But selling her isn't just about making something nice. You'll need to tell people why she's special, why she's important." Keisha frowned in thought. "She's special because she's me," she said quietly. "And because other kids need to see her." "That's exactly right," Marcus said, his voice soft but steady. "So let's start small. We'll see if the store owner likes her, and if he does, we'll go from there." The following Saturday, Marcus and Keisha walked into the small neighborhood toy store. It wasn't a big chain like the ones at the mall. It was run by a local family who had been part of the community for decades. The shelves were lined with wooden trains, handcrafted puzzles, and stuffed animals with hand-stitched details. It was the kind of place that valued stories as much as products. Mr. Patel, the owner, greeted them warmly. "Marcus, it's been a while. What brings you in today?" Keisha stepped forward before her father could respond, holding the doll out with both hands. "Mr. Patel, this is a doll I made. I think other kids might like her. Will you sell her in your store?" Mr. Patel chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "Well, aren't you a little entrepreneur?" he said, taking the doll from her hands. He inspected it carefully, turning it over and admiring the craftsmanship. "You made this yourself?" "With my dad's help," Keisha said proudly. "But it was my idea." Mr. Patel nodded thoughtfully. "You've got something special here, young lady. I'd be happy to put her on the shelf." Keisha's eyes lit up. "Really? Really?" Mr. Patel said. "Let's start with a few and see how they do. Bring me 3 more by next week, and we'll give it a try." That night, Keisha and Marcus celebrated with hot chocolate and cookies, their laughter filling the small house. Keisha's excitement was contagious, but Marcus couldn't help but feel a twinge of apprehension. He knew that the world didn't always embrace new ideas, especially when they came from people like them. Still, he resolved to support his daughter's vision with everything he had. Over the next few weeks, Keisha's dolls began to gain attention. Customers at Mr. Patel's store were drawn to their unique designs and the story behind them. Word spread through the neighborhood, and soon, local newspapers were running stories about the young girl who was making waves in the toy world. It wasn't long before the story reached Robert. Sitting in his home office, Robert scrolled through an article titled, "Young Innovator Redefines Playtime. Keisha Johnson's Dolls Spark a Movement." His heart skipped a beat as he recognized the name. The article was accompanied by a photo of Keisha standing proudly beside a display of her dolls, her bright smile lighting up the room. Robert felt a pang of guilt as he read about her journey. The article mentioned the dismissal she had faced at the mall, though it didn't name him specifically. He felt a mix of shame and pride, shame for his role in her early rejection, and pride in seeing how far she had come despite it. The next day, Robert made a phone call. Using his industry connections, he arranged a meeting with one of his former colleagues at Horizon Toys. He shared Keisha's story, pitching the idea of a collaboration between Horizon and Keisha's growing brand. "This isn't just good business," Robert said firmly. "It's the right thing to do. And if Horizon doesn't get behind this, someone else will." His colleague agreed to set up a meeting with the company's executives. Meanwhile, Marcus and Keisha were overwhelmed by the response to her dolls. Orders began to pour in, not just from their neighborhood but from across the city. Marcus spent his evenings helping Keisha sew and paint, their living room transforming into a miniature production line. It was exhausting but exhilarating. "Daddy, do you think we'll need a factory someday?" Keisha asked as she painted the face of a new doll. Marcus chuckled. "At the rate you're going, we just might." The meeting at Horizon Toys was set for the following month. When Marcus told Keisha about it, She was nervous but excited. "What if they don't like me?" she asked one night, her voice small. "They'll love you," Marcus said firmly. "And even if they don't, that doesn't change how amazing you are. You've already proven them wrong, Keisha. This is just the next step." Keisha nodded, her father's confidence bolstering her own. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it head-on. The day of the meeting at Horizon Toys arrived faster than Keisha had anticipated. The towering glass building, with its sleek modern design and expansive lobby, was nothing like the warm, familiar toy store where her journey had begun. As she stepped inside with Marcus by her side, her small hand gripping a carefully prepared prototype of her doll, she couldn't help but feel a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. "Are you ready, baby girl?" Marcus asked softly, leaning down so only she could hear. Keisha nodded, her determination outweighing her nerves. "I'm ready." The receptionist, a polished woman in a sharp blazer, directed them to a conference room on the top floor. The elevator ride felt endless, the soft hum of classical music doing little to calm Keisha's racing heart. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his presence grounding her. When the doors opened, they were greeted by Robert Kavanaugh. He looked different without the Santa suit, older, perhaps more vulnerable, but his smile was warm and genuine. "Keisha, Marcus," Robert said, extending a hand. "I'm glad you're here." Keisha hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand. "Thank you for inviting us, Mr. Kavanaugh." "Call me Robert," he said with a slight chuckle. "This is your meeting, after all." He led them into the conference room, where a group of executives sat around a sleek table. Each one wore an expression of polite curiosity, their eyes flicking between Marcus, Keisha, and the doll in her hands. Keisha felt small in their presence, but she reminded herself of her father's words. "You've already proven them wrong. This is just the next step." Robert began the meeting with a brief introduction, outlining Keisha's journey and the significance of her dolls. He emphasized the growing demand for representation in toys and the potential market value of partnering with Keisha's brand. "This isn't just about filling a gap in the market," Robert said, his tone firm. "It's about leading the industry into a future that reflects the world we live in." The executives nodded along, their expressions thoughtful but guarded. Finally, Robert turned to Keisha. "Why don't you tell us about your dolls, Keisha?" Keisha took a deep breath and stepped forward. She placed her doll on the table, her small hands trembling slightly as she straightened its tiny lab coat. "This is Dr. Zoe," she began, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. "She's a scientist. She likes to ask questions and find answers. I made her because I want kids like me to see that they can be scientists too." She looked up, meeting the eyes of each executive in turn. "When I was little, I couldn't find any dolls that looked like me, so I decided to make one, and I think other kids would like her too." The room was silent for a moment. Then one of the executives, a woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned forward. "Keisha, this is a very impressive doll. But what makes it different from the other STEM toys on the market?" Keisha hesitated, glancing at Marcus. He gave her a small nod, encouraging her to speak from her heart. "She's different because she's real," Keisha said finally. "She's not just a toy, she's a friend. She shows kids that they can be anything they want, even if the world doesn't always tell them that. And she's special because she's me." The executive's expression softened, and a few others murmured their approval. Marcus felt a swell of pride as he watched his daughter hold her ground with poise and conviction. After Keisha's presentation, the room shifted into a lively discussion. Some executives were enthusiastic about the idea, praising its innovation and potential to tap into an underserved market. Others were more cautious, raising concerns about production costs and marketability. Robert stepped in, addressing their concerns with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades in the industry. "This isn't just a business opportunity," he said. "It's a chance to lead by example. Horizon Toys has the resources to make this a success, and the responsibility to do so." The discussion lasted over an hour, and by the end, The executives seemed largely convinced. The CEO, a reserved man with silver hair and an air of authority, stood and extended his hand to Keisha. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice warm, "you've made a strong case today. We'd be honored to work with you." Keisha's eyes widened, and she looked to Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. She shook the CEO's hand, her small fingers dwarfed by his. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As they left the building, Keisha clutched her doll tightly, her excitement bubbling over. "Daddy, we did it!" she exclaimed, skipping down the sidewalk. Marcus chuckled, his heart swelling with pride. "You did it, Keisha. This was all you." Robert walked a few paces behind them, watching the pair with a mixture of admiration and regret. He knew that this moment was just the beginning of Keisha's journey, but it was also the culmination of a lesson he had learned too late, that the world's greatest potential often lay in the places people overlooked. By the end of the week, Horizon Toys announced its partnership with Keisha's brand. The news spread quickly, capturing the attention of media outlets and sparking conversations about diversity in the toy industry. Keisha's dolls became a symbol of change, and her story inspired countless others to believe in the power of representation. As orders poured in and production ramped up, Keisha's small dining table workshop transformed into a full-fledged business. But through it all, she remained grounded, her father's words always echoing in her mind. "You're going to change the world." Keisha's dolls were flying off the shelves. Horizon Toys had launched a limited run of her designs, branding the line as Dream Makers, with a tagline that read, "Toys that reflect every child's potential." The response was overwhelmingly positive, with parents sharing heartfelt stories about what the dolls meant to their children. Social media buzzed with praise, and orders poured in from across the country. But success, as Marcus had warned Keisha, wasn't without its challenges. Keisha was at home, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor surrounded by prototypes of her dolls. Each one had a unique profession: a scientist, a firefighter, a coder, even a chef. Marcus was cooking dinner in the kitchen, glancing occasionally at his daughter as she tinkered with a tiny stethoscope for her doctor doll. The phone buzzed on the counter, and Marcus wiped his hands before answering. It was Robert. "Marcus," Robert said, his tone serious, "we need to talk. There's been some pushback." Marcus frowned. "Pushback from who?" "Traditionalists," Robert replied. "Some of our longtime customers don't like the direction we're taking. They think the dolls are too political." Marcus's grip tightened on the phone. "How is making dolls that look like real kids political?" "I know," Robert said with a sigh, "but you'd be surprised how resistant some people can be to change. I wanted to warn you because it might get ugly. We've already started receiving complaints, and some of them are, well, let's just say they're not pretty." Marcus glanced at Keisha, who was humming to herself as she worked. "Thanks for the heads up," he said finally. "But Keisha can handle it. She's tougher than she looks." The backlash began as murmurs in online forums and slowly escalated. Anonymous comments accused the company of pandering to woke culture and pushing an agenda. A few conservative media outlets picked up the story, framing it as an unnecessary shift in the toy industry. Keisha wasn't completely shielded from the negativity. She heard snippets of conversations between her father and Robert, saw the headlines when Marcus forgot to turn off the TV. At first, she didn't understand why anyone would be upset about her dolls. "Daddy, why don't they like my dolls?" she asked one evening, her voice tinged with confusion. Marcus sighed, setting aside the book he'd been reading. "Some people don't like things that are different, Keisha. They get scared when the world starts to change, even if it's for the better." "But I'm not hurting anyone," she said, frowning. "I just want kids to feel happy when they see my dolls." "I know, baby girl," Marcus said, pulling her into a hug. "And most people see that. The ones who don't, they're just loud. But loud doesn't mean right." The noise grew louder when a high-profile blogger posted a scathing review of the Dream Makers line, accusing the company of alienating traditional families. The blog went viral, sparking a heated debate on social media. While many defended the dolls, Others doubled down on their criticism, calling for boycotts. Keisha, despite Marcus's efforts to protect her, began to feel the pressure. One afternoon, as she worked on a new design, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the fabric. She turned to Marcus, who was fixing a leaky faucet in the kitchen. "Daddy," she said softly, "do you think I should stop making the dolls?" Marcus straightened, his brow furrowing. "Why would you say that?" "Because not everyone likes them," she said, looking down at her hands. "Maybe I'm doing something wrong." Marcus set his tools aside and walked over to her, crouching down so they were eye level. "Keisha, look at me," he said firmly. She lifted her gaze to meet his. "The only thing you're doing wrong is doubting yourself. The people who don't like your dolls? They're not the ones you're making them for. You're doing this for the kids who look at your dolls and see themselves for the first time. Don't ever forget that." Keisha nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I won't." As the backlash continued, Robert took a bold step. He arranged a press conference to address the controversy head-on, inviting Marcus and Keisha to join him. It was a risky move, but he believed in the importance of standing by their mission. The day of the press conference, Keisha wore her best dress and held one of her dolls tightly in her hands. Marcus stood by her side, his presence steady and reassuring. Robert opened the event with a short speech, acknowledging the criticism but reaffirming the company's commitment to diversity and inclusivity. Then he introduced Keisha. She stepped up to the podium, her small frame dwarfed by the microphone. But when she spoke, her voice was clear and steady. "I started making these dolls because I wanted kids like me to feel like they belonged," she said. "I didn't know it would make some people upset, but I know it's the right thing to do. Every kid deserves to see themselves in the toys they play with. And I'm not going to stop." The room fell silent for a moment before erupting in applause. Marcus felt a swell of pride as he watched his daughter stand her ground with courage and grace. The press conference marked a turning point. Public support for the Dream Makers line surged, drowning out the voices of dissent. Sales skyrocketed, and Keisha's dolls became a symbol of progress in the toy industry. Through it all, Keisha remained grounded, her focus on creating new designs and inspiring others. The challenges she faced only strengthened her resolve, proving to her, and to the world, that change was worth fighting for. The Dream Makers line was no longer just a toy collection, it was a movement. Keisha's story had inspired countless others to push for greater representation, not just in toys but in books, media, and education. The national spotlight on her success prompted discussions on major platforms, with thought leaders and activists championing her vision. But with greater visibility came greater challenges. Competitors in the toy industry began producing their own versions of diverse dolls, many of which felt tokenistic and rushed. Horizon Toys, while supportive of Keisha's brand, found itself under scrutiny as people questioned whether their partnership was driven by genuine change or profit motives. Keisha, now 12 years old, was no longer the shy girl who had once been dismissed by Santa. She had grown into a confident young entrepreneur with a sharp understanding of her mission. At a conference hosted by Horizon Toys, Keisha stood on stage before a packed auditorium of executives, journalists, and fellow creators. "I didn't start making dolls to sell toys," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I started because I wanted every kid to feel like they matter. This isn't just about representation. It's about showing the world that we're all worth celebrating." Her words resonated deeply, earning her a standing ovation. Even the executives at Horizon Toys, many of whom had initially doubted her, couldn't help but admire her conviction. Years later, Keisha's company, Dream Makers Incorporated, had become a household name. Her dolls were available in stores worldwide, and her vision had expanded to include books, educational kits, and even animated shows featuring her characters. The tagline "Toys that reflect every child's potential" had become a rallying cry for change across industries. Keisha, now in her early 20s, stood in the headquarters of her company, a vibrant, bustling space filled with a diverse team of designers, engineers, and marketers. Marcus, her ever-supportive father, had retired from his job at the hardware store and now worked as the head of operations for Dreammakers. One afternoon, Keisha received a surprise visitor, Robert Kavanaugh. Now in his 80s, Robert had become one of her most vocal advocates, often using his connections to open doors for her company. He had retired from Horizon Toys years ago but remained deeply involved in Keisha's journey. As they sat together in her office, Robert handed her an old photo, a picture of her 8-year-old self, standing beside him at the mall in his Santa suit. Keisha laughed, shaking her head at the memory. "I wasn't very kind to you that day," Robert admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "But you taught me something I should have learned a long time ago. You showed me the world through your eyes, and I'm forever grateful for that." Keisha smiled warmly. "I think we both learned something that day," she said, "and I'm glad we did." Later that year, Keisha was invited to speak at a global summit on diversity and inclusion. Standing before an audience of thousands, she reflected on her journey. From the little girl who had been dismissed by Santa to the CEO of a company that had changed the toy industry forever. "This isn't just my story," she said, her voice carrying across the auditorium. "It's the story of everyone who's ever been told they don't belong, everyone who's ever been made to feel small. I want you to know that you do belong. You are seen, and you are enough." The audience erupted into applause, and as Keisha stepped off the stage, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. She had not only built a successful business, but had also paved the way for others to follow in her footsteps. One snowy Christmas morning, Keisha and Marcus visited the same mall where her journey had begun. It had been years since they'd last set foot there, but the memories were vivid. The Santa display was still there, though it now featured a rotating cast of diverse Santas, each one representing a different community. As they watched a new generation of children share their wishes with Santa, Marcus turned to Keisha and smiled. "You've come a long way, baby girl." Keisha nodded, her eyes shining. "We both have." The snow began to fall gently outside, and as they walked back to their car, Keisha looked up at the sky, a sense of peace washing over her. She had turned a moment of rejection into a legacy of belonging, and the world was better for it.